really, this is not complicated. It's obvious. If there is some projection or a lot of projection involved in your contract, they don't really want to engage in it because that's risk. It just goes back to the thing of as great as trading for George Pickens is, because there is some risk there, they don't like to engage in risk. And risk is involved in projection. So, yeah, sometimes you might be wrong. You may guess the number, and the number may be high. You may guess the number, and the player gets hurt, and there's risk there. There's zero risk, as you described, in making Jake Ferguson the seventh highest paid tight end. Like, it seems – I'll tell you what is odd to me about it. If you walk through the timeline. So they drafted him – or Ferguson shows up in, 22? And then in that offseason, they let Dalton Schultz walk. So Dalton Schultz leaves in that offseason and goes and plays in the Texans starting in 2023. And that's the year Jake Ferguson breaks out. Huge numbers. Really, he looked to me like Dalton Schultz. He just looked like a developed Dalton Schultz, leading you to think, hey, you can roll out of bed and get 60 and 700 as a tight end in this offense because Dak's going to get you. But then they drafted Luke Schoonmaker in the second round that year, which made me think, all right, that's a little weird because you just let a pretty good tight end walk who was productive after that got really sideways. Now, Dalton Schultz looks like he had an egg on his face at first because he had to take a 1 year prove it, but he just signed a 3-year deal. He got his, right? That worked out for him. Dallas goes back to the drawing board with Luke Schoonmaker, and my thought is, all right, well, they're just going to throw bullets at this tight end position, but they don't see it as one that they have to really, throw a lot of resources at. You know, we got a second-round pick in here. We got Ferguson. Well, now you're just paying Jake Ferguson the exact same contract relative to the cap that you could have had with Dalton Schultz. And if you had just done that, you probably don't waste a second-round pick on Luke Schoonmaker in the process. Yeah, he's a couple years younger, Ferguson, than Schultz. But this just goes back to your point of, there's really no consistent thing here.
Right. If they had said, all right, we're going to let Jake Ferguson walk, because you said this when they let Dalton Schultz walk. You said the problem with Dalton Schultz is Dalton Schultz, and that you feel like you can draft another Dalton Schultz in the third round.
Right.
You don't really need to you don't have to pay a
guy
like that. He's not a game breaker. There are difference-making tight ends, kind of like quarterbacks, right? There's three guys, and you could argue at certain times who's the San Francisco tight end. You got Kelsey.
Yeah.
And there's always
a new crop coming, but yeah.
There's always a few that really stand out, and they're really worthy. Otherwise, it's the running back position, certain positions.
And it felt like that's where the Cowboys were headed.
And I felt good about that.
Because
why not? Okay, you got to say you're paying these high-end stars. Okay, don't put $12 million at tight end.
I think I'm on team. You've got to have a really good second wide receiver in the NFL. But I would concede that once you do not need a top tier tight end.
Right.
You need a guy. You need to protect your quarterback.
But if you have a top tier tight end, you might not need that second wide receiver to have as much resources.
So, not only was Dalton Schultz the best argument for not bringing back Dalton Schultz, if you wanted to make that argument, the second best one was then Jake Ferguson was just also really good the year he replaced Dalton Schultz, and he was a fourth Hendershot was undrafted. Ferguson was, I think. The point is,
you could find him.
We just did it. Okay. Well,
you could find a 1,000-yard rusher.
Then they went.
You can't find a Barkley.
Then they went and took Schoonmaker, which I hated at the time, and I'm not even draft guy. I just hate bucking the big board by 48, 50 spots. It almost never works. And so they drafted Luke Schoonmaker that year after taking Mozzie in the first round, and it was like, well, he looks a lot like Dalton Schultz and Jake Ferguson to me. There was Dalton Kincaid, who went in the first round, who's a pass-catching threat more. Yeah. Sam Laporta, same type. Michael Mayer in the first round, more of a blocking type. They just drafted another guy who's very similar to Ferguson, which I guess, again, you could defend right up until the point they then also pay Jake Ferguson. Yeah. That's the thing that I have a hard time squaring. It just seems like there's a little bit of the money people and the scouting people seem to get crossways. But I am happy for Jake Ferguson. Guy finally gets a win in his life, Blake.
Well,
My wife asked me, I always judge this. This lets you know how out my wife was on the Cowboys, at least last year. She said, what are you writing Cowboys? I was like, well, they signed Jake Ferguson. She said, who is that? I said, they're tight end. And she goes, white guy? And I said, yeah. And she goes, hot? I said, yeah. And I showed her. And she's like, oh, it's the Cavender twin.
Yeah.
Like,